Greetings, everyone. My name is Jason Swanson. I'm the Director of Strategic Foresight with the KnowledgeWorks Foundation. And it's my pleasure to be able to share with you some material from our latest comprehensive forecast on the future of learning, Forecast 5.0, Navigating the Future of Learning. So for those of you who may not be familiar with KnowledgeWorks, we're a national nonprofit headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we work all throughout the United States to really engage in systems transformation. It's our core belief that every student should have access to meaningful personalized learning so that they're ready for what's next. And one of the things that makes KnowledgeWorks fairly unique in this realm, in this sector, is that we've been rigorously exploring the future of learning since 2006. So I'm part of a 4-person team who is tasked with nothing but exploring futures for education and then creating sense-making documents and devices and engaging in conversation, much like this. So when we're thinking about the future of learning and we're thinking about really change and possibility, our forecast really explores what we consider like a major narrative of change or a big story of change. And we began really thinking about kind of this big story as part of our last comprehensive forecast. And then 3 years on, that we're finding that that story still holds. But that story of change, from our view and according to our research, is that we are in the midst of really an era shift. So we're moving from one point in history with certain defining features and characteristics to really a new point in history for which there are new defining features or characteristics. So it's a fairly simplistic explanation, but under all that simplicity hides really, really deep change, right? So from our view and our research, one of the major factors for that change driving us into this new era is really the exponential advances in digital technology. So it's because of that accelerating technology that we believe that the critical hallmark or characteristic of this new era is the need to partner with the code in our digital devices to really make sense of the world around us. So we've taken to calling this new era the era of partners in code because of that sort of critical hallmark. So, digital technology, exponential change is certainly not the only reason that the future will be different than the present. And our forecast details other forces of change that we call drivers of change, and that are really exogenous to education. So these are forces of change that are impacting education sort of from the outside in, and not necessarily trend lines that are happening within education. So those drivers of change include automating choices, which really looks at a trend line where we're seeing near ubiquity in terms of narrow artificial intelligence and machine learning. We're using it to really make sense of vast sources of data. We're using it to do things like get us from point A to point B with GPS. But sort of this near constant ubiquitousness of such technologies are really causing us to ask a lot of deep questions around things like the role of human agency in decision making, and really pose a lot of deep questions and opportunities and challenges for learning. Our next driver is one we call civic superpowers, which really looks at what is being perceived as a growing governance gap, at least at the federal level, as power and decision-making really is beginning to flow down to states and cities. And it's also looking at it as we kind of go through that transition, how a lot of participatory democracy and the tools in which we use to engage in civil society are moving out of, in effect, the town square and into the digital sphere. Our third driver of change is one we call accelerating brains, which looks at how really accelerating technologies are allowing us to really begin to play with our cognition in intended ways and unintended ways. So the intended side of this could include the trend line where we're seeing a lot of consumer-facing devices being used to treat things like PTSD, anxiety, and depression, to help us perform better, both in the realm of athletics and also the realm of academia. And also the unintended side, which really includes ideas like if we're entering this new era of partners in code and we're increasingly dependent on our digital devices, what might be the long-term neurological ramifications of device use and persuasive technology? Our fourth driver is one we call toxic narratives, which looks at the trend line around chronic mental health disease, including anxiety and depression. And really the idea that a lot of the narratives around academic success and really a high pressure competitive based system of education might be contributing to those illnesses. And then last but not least, remaking geographies is our fifth driver of change. It's personally my favorite. Really looks at how geographies and communities are really looking at what it means to have a sense of place. It looks at trend lines around migration patterns for people. It explores really a trend line really moving away from scalable efficiencies in terms of our economic models, and really explores how cities, as they redefine notions of place, might also redefine notions of revitalization and the strategies for which a location might begin to achieve those. So if those are all our drivers that we view as being one, causal to the domain of education, and also presenting us with some really unique possibilities and challenges in the arena of learning. What does it mean? So what assumptions do we have to make about that velocity of change, how those trends might slow down, speed up, even reverse or stop, and begin to maybe even combine with each other and other trends. So when we make those assumptions, what becomes possible, plausible, even preferable in learning? Well, for us, we saw four really big buckets or areas for opportunity that these changes begin to present. The first of which is something we're calling signature learning ecosystems, which looks at the ways that communities might lead with learning, so to speak. So what does it mean for a city to create a unique learning ecosystem that speaks to their history, their culture, and begins to adapt really a model of learning that takes into account a diversity of providers across many, many sectors, all of which contribute and surround a learner on their journey. So what might that look like? We played with the idea of human-centered learning. So if we're looking at the emergence of personalized learning as a new organizing principle for learning, what comes next? So what might personalized learning 2.0 look like? What might be like the third horizon there? And for us, it really looks or prioritizes a myth and metaphor for learning around healing, around restorative practices, really learning as an act of social justice, rather than learning that's just simply tailored to a learner for something like workforce development. Our third bucket or area of opportunity is one we're calling safeguards for efficacy, which looks at really this idea, much like the ubiquity of AI and machine learning in our daily lives, as more and more of those technologies creep into the arena of education, as we're looking at an increased footprint from ed tech companies for learning. What might those new safeguards for efficacy look like? What new paradigms for data might be needed beyond just the school as sort of the steward or protector of student data? And how can we ensure ethical practices around technology and use in education? And then lastly, our fourth bucket is one we call amplified voice and impact. So this really asks questions around, how can we radically expand power and decision-making in education to really include the community and not just a school board, and include even teachers and youth in the decision-making process. So besides these buckets, our forecast looks at really more granular images of the future, things that we call provocations for learning. These are usually cast as kind of like what if statements or grand design challenges. And a couple of those might include ideas around like, what if educational placemaking leveraged long-term learning and projects to help revitalize a community? So what happens if that becomes one of the central levers in revitalizing a geography? Asking questions around roles, right? So what if community network builders were a role that we saw within learning, and those folks would be people that would work to foster partnership and really cross-cultural understanding using personal and digital networks. We saw possibilities for follow me schools. So these would be schools that would provide continuity for students as they experience disruption due to things like climate volatility. So this wouldn't simply be an add-on, something like just, hey, we're experiencing disruption, go do an online platform. But in an age where we can offer really strong, meaningful, personalized learning, what does that look like in the face of deep disruption and system shocks? So one last provocation I'd be happy to share too would be something like, what if we began to see things like machine learning open education resources that help teachers to develop and share tools that leveraged artificial intelligence? So what would happen if we see machine learning being employed in schools, were made by teachers, vetted by teachers, and customized by teachers, and frankly, just open to everyone? So if those are some possibilities for the future as derived from some of those changes I highlighted, really at the end of the day, because of those changes, no matter what future that you're seeking to advocate for, no matter what your vision for education, no matter what that might be, there are some cross-cutting implications that I think everybody needs to be aware of. The first of which is really just the need to design intentionally with equity in mind. The changes on the horizon have real possibility to actually bridge that equity gap if we're thinking in a very transformational manner. But if we don't have equity front and center, it could mean we could drastically widen existing equity gaps because of those changes. We're going to have to really learn the difference between efficiency and transformation as well. And I think everybody needs to be aware of this implication, not just those within education, but in an age of automation and leveraging really big efficiencies, there are going to be a lot of things proposed to and sold to learning communities that are offered up as transformation. When in reality, they're just kind of extending the present and leveraging a lot of efficiencies in ways that might look transformative. Now, having a time dividend is always a good thing, but for schools to be asking really deep questions about what is extending the present, what are the things that we need to get rid of, what do transformational practices really, really look like, and to know the difference is going to be a critical skill for the future. And then lastly, one of the implications that we feel fairly strongly about too is that not only do we need to distinguish between efficiency and transformation, but as we're looking at more like whiz-bang technology, and as we bring in more of a digital layer to learning, we're going to have to develop new terms and conditions for technology use. This is going to really begin to include things that I mentioned already, like thinking about different paradigms for data ownership, but really thinking about how these technologies are employed and why they're employed and what might need to shift to be able to really fulfill the full promise of these technologies is going to be vitally important. So that's it for me. I want to thank everybody. Should you have any questions about anything we've written, feel free to email me, swansonj@knowledgeworks.org, and visit our website, www.knowledgeworks.org, and you can download any of the material we've ever published. And thanks.